Hello folks and welcome to another SACPA session. We are here today with Stefan de Villiers. I'm hoping I'm saying that correct. Thank you for joining us. SACPA acknowledges that this event takes place on the lands of the Blackfoot people and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and we pay respect to their past, present and future cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship to the land. SACPA commits to assist reconciliation efforts by raising awareness of the ways past and present injustices can be reconciled. SACPA is very thankful for the continuing support we receive from the University of Lethbridge, Shaw Spotlight, and the Lethbridge Herald. Stefan, who's with us today, and thank you very much for joining us today, Stefan, is the coordinator of the Male Domestic Abuse Outreach Program at the Calgary Counselling Centre. Stefan's social work career spans outreach and clinical work with individuals, couples, and families impacted by domestic violence. He holds a master's of social work degree from the University of Calgary, as well as a postgraduate certificate in traumatic stress studies. Stefan participates on numerous domestic violence related working groups, including as a gender and sexual diversity advisory board member to the Calgary Police Service, and as a member of the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective Ethno-Cultural Diverse Communities Working Group. He is an educator and has presented on men's experience of abuse at numerous conferences, including the Canadian Domestic Violence Conference and the International Federation of Social Workers Conference. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us here today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Annalise, and I want to just thank SACPA for inviting me to do this presentation. I'm very happy to be here. So my presentation today is called Not Alone, and we're going to be talking about men's experiences of domestic abuse. Just a little bit about the agency that I'm part of. So Calgary Counselling Centre is a mental health agency based within Calgary that provides generalist mental health services. And as part of the services that we provide, we also provide family violence prevention services to individuals that are using violence, as well as to individuals that are experiencing violence. So under that, I guess, umbrella, that's where my program exists. And next slide, please. What we offer through the Male Domestic Abuse Outreach Program is outreach services. So this is a service that's free. There's no charge. Individuals really across the province of Alberta can call in to get information on abuse, to be connected with resources, to get some crisis counseling if they need it. And there's no referral needed for accessing our outreach line. It isn't a crisis line, but we do respond within 24 hours. And the second type of service that we provide for men who experience abuse is counseling services. So we provide counseling for individuals, for couples. We also have some group programming as well, and there is no wait list for that as a service. There is a sliding scale, which means there is a small fee associated with that. But again, there's no referral needed, and it is based on reported household income, self-reported household income. Then the third thing that the third service that I offer is really just to do public education, like I'm doing today, is going out and meeting with the public and meeting with community organizations that work within the field of domestic violence, to provide some education, some resources, and then also we work fairly closely in the past we have with researchers that are looking at this topic, because it is a relatively under-researched area, learning more about men's experiences of domestic violence and abuse. Next slide, please. I'm going to just start by providing the definition that we use in our program for what we mean by domestic abuse. So the way that we frame it is that it's an ongoing pattern of controlling behavior where the goal is for the one partner to subordinate or isolate or intimidate the other person. And I think the important thing to be aware of when we're talking about issues around domestic abuse is that we're not necessarily talking about just physical violence. It is a lot larger than that. And really, I think the more we learn about it, we're understanding that it's really about coercion, and that can be done in a variety of different ways, either psychological, physical, sexual, financial, or emotionally. So there are a lot of different ways that people can go about trying to intimidate or intimidate the other person. So some examples that we might encounter from the clients that come into our program is that they'll share experiences of being isolated from their support network, or that they're being monitored. Video cameras are being put in around the house, or that they're being called names, put down. We also get cases where men are experiencing health issues, and then they're being denied their medications, or they're being attacked when they're asleep. So it really comes in all kinds of different forms. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question I often get asked as an outreach worker, as a public educator, is male domestic abuse rare in terms of men experiencing it? And there isn't a lot of data about it. It's still a fairly under-researched area, but the data that we do have does indicate that it is probably more common than most of us think it is. So the statistic I have on this slide, indicates that in 2018, Statistics Canada found that 36% of men who completed a survey reported experiencing some form of psychological, physical, or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So just for comparison, when women completed that questionnaire, it came out at 44%. So slightly lower, but still fairly high. We also see that, in sort of police reported instances of domestic abuse, the numbers are quite different. So they're about 80% are female victims that are stepping forward, and about 20% are males. But even that number indicates that, 20% is still quite a large number, and indicates that those men need services as well. Slide, please. So I want to talk about just the way that abuse can show up differently for men, because I think there are some differences. Um, Oftentimes we kind of lump together abuse as a one type of thing, and as I've already mentioned, there are different types of abuse, and it can be experienced differently between men and women. And I know I'm using the binary, and it's not because I'm not acknowledging that there are other genders. It's simply that we only have data really on the experiences of men and women. There's less data available on sexual minorities and under other gender minorities. But we know that men's experiences from the data of abuse is that they often minimize it, and they don't realize that they're in an abusive situation. And part of that is the socialization that men experience, where they're kind of taught from a young age that emotions aren't something that you show, that vulnerability is not something that you want to share with other people, that you should be strong, that you should suck it up. So all of these sort of social messaging that we have in our culture around masculinity really makes it difficult for men who are experiencing abuse to recognize what they're experiencing first of all, and then to reach out for help and get support. Unfortunately, I also hear many stories of men, reaching out to family doctors, or going to, a church pastor, or talking to a counselor, and getting a very negative experience, or not being believed. And so, with those kinds of experiences, it just becomes more and more difficult for men to reach out, because they don't know what kind of response they're going to get. Next slide. So the types of men that we see at our program, I've kind of divided them into 4 different types. So like I said, our outreach line is open to the public. Anybody can call in. So some people that call in are men that are just, they're in an unhappy relationship. They don't know if they're being abused. They're not sure. They're kind of looking for an expert opinion on that. And so they're just looking for information and looking for options, right? So for those types of clients, we might suggest that they come in for a more thorough assessment around the health of the relationship. And if we determine that it's not necessarily abuse, but it's an unhappy situation that needs addressing, we might suggest couples counseling in those cases. The second type of client that might come in are men that, they want to help their partner, whether that partner is a woman or another man. They see that their partner is behaving in a way that's abusive, but they believe that that is coming from their own history of trauma, or that they just need help. So in those cases, again, we do a fairly thorough assessment, trying to figure out what the relationship dynamics are, whether there is some accountability on the part of the abuser, and then we work with the family system to try and help them be supported. So that might look like individual counseling. It might look like group counseling for the abuser. It might look like helping the kids, if there are kids, also accessing some support as well. Because we know that kids observing domestic violence, whether it's from a man or from a woman or anyone, has lifelong impact. The third type of client that we're seeing are simply men that are, by any objective standard, experiencing domestic abuse. And so in those cases, we really meet the men where they are. Some men, they want to stay in the relationship. They want to try and make it work. Some men are ready to leave and they just want to know how to do that. Some men are, just looking to be connected with other resources like lawyers that can help them figure out custody. So we really see a little bit of everything. And then, of course, there are the men that are simply looking for counseling for themselves. And then the fourth type of man that we do see, but it is fairly rare, are men that are saying that they are victims, but they are actually, I would say, the primary aggressor, or they are using controlling behavior in the relationship. And that is something that we find out as we do our screening and our assessment process. And then we try to, connect them with resources, because obviously they're not happy. They know something is not working. Maybe there isn't accountability yet, but there may be an opening for us to intervene and help them to recognize their own behavior as abusive, and to connect them with appropriate resources as well. Next slide, please. All right, so the next slide is really about just outlining some of the impacts that we see. Another question that often gets asked of me is whether whether the impact of domestic abuse on men is as severe as on women, which, I mean, I don't love that question, but I think the takeaway I hope that you all will have from today is that it does have long-term impacts. The type of abuse that men are experiencing, people are experiencing pretty severe physical health consequences, whether that's loss of weight, headaches, sleep problems. If they have underlying existing health conditions, those can worsen. PTSD symptoms, where they're, having intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. Alcohol and drug abuse is a common thing as well as a coping mechanism. It can have negative impacts on their functioning in a work environment where they can't necessarily concentrate. Their other relationships might be impacted. We know that often in coercive environments, the abuser might be isolating the partner from their support network, so they may lose contact with friends and with family members, and can feel very isolated. And then the parenting piece. Unfortunately, even if they do decide to leave the relationship, it doesn't mean the abuse ends when there are kids involved. And, for men, it can be a very difficult journey to maintain a relationship with their kids when they're navigating the family law system. It can be incredibly challenging. Next slide. Yeah, so some other impacts on men's mental health. So many men struggle with thoughts of suicide. They report, being fearful. There is a strong loss of an identity, as a husband, as a father, as a provider that goes with this experience. There's a lack of self-esteem that we often see. Anxiety and depression are incredibly common experiences. I'm not going to read all of these bullet points, but yeah, just a sense of overall, embarrassment, a sense of not living up to the masculine ideal of, being in control, being able to fix their own problems, and that can have a really negative impact on their sense of self. Next slide, please. So common symptoms that we see among men, I've covered some of them, but this is, I guess, more objective data that we collect from our intake process and from our groups that we run. We evaluate all our programs and get outcome data from those. So the last column on the slide is some of the numbers that we see among our men's group that we run for men who experience violence. So we see symptoms of dissociation, right? So where men are numbing out their emotions, trying to just kind of disconnect from themselves in a way, in an attempt to cope. I've already mentioned anxiety and depression. Sexual abuse can be an issue as well. Sleep insomnia is very common side effect, and then sexual disturbances or difficulties as well. Next slide, please. A concerning thing that we're seeing also with the clients that are coming in for services is that they are, 30% of them in this data set that I'm showing on the slide reported expressing suicidal thoughts and ideation. And we know that this is concerning because, men are a high-risk group when it comes to suicide, particularly in the age group that we tend to see in our agency, which is around the age of 40 for this program. That age group between 40 and 60, that is a high-risk group for suicidal suicide attempts. And yeah, so these men are really suffering when by the time that they reach us and that they are reaching out for professional supports. Next slide. Thank you. So substance misuse is another common issue that men come in with. We don't at our agency provide, addiction counseling per se, but we can connect them with other resources to support them with that. But yeah, so about 23%, almost a quarter of the men that are accessing the program do have struggles with substance use. So that is something that we're always screening for as well. So I thought I'd just, next slide, please. I thought I would just quickly go through the program assessment, how we, what we look for when we get new clients coming in. So like I mentioned, we screen for the dynamics in the relationship, whether, who's doing what to whom, what are what kinds of abuse are showing up in the relationship. There's a big emphasis on really identifying risk. And working with the client to identify how to keep them safe, how to keep their kids safe, or if there are kids involved, and then identifying the needs that they have, really customizing our response to be appropriate to them. Next slide, please. Some of the questions that we might ask in an assessment would be, can you tell me about the last time something violent or frightening happened? What do you usually do when this happens? What's the worst time there's been? Have you ever been injured? Have your kids ever been injured? And these kinds of questions help us to determine, well, a number of things. For example, whether the abuse is unilateral from one side to the other, or sometimes there is abuse that's bidirectional from both parties. And so we want to be able to identify that as a risk factor. It also gives us a sense of the severity of the abuse that's happening, the frequency of it. These are all things that we are paying attention to. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of safety, that's a very big part of my job, is to really pay attention to, how can we keep everyone in the home safe, including the person that is using abuse. And so, often we'll work with the person coming in to figure out, I mean, can you have a bag ready to go that you can just grab and go? Can you have somebody on speed dial that you can call that can come over if you need somebody to be there? Do your kids have some place to go or to someone to call if you're not at home? So all of these kinds of things are questions that we work with the clients collaboratively to help them, forge a path forward. Next slide, please. And the other piece that we always also want to celebrate are people's resilience and their strengths and the resources that they have. The fact that they're reaching out for support, that already indicates, strength in my estimation. It's not an easy thing to ask for help, particularly when we're talking about what's happening in the family, and sometimes it feels very vulnerable to do that. So we work with clients to identify, their existing support networks, what kind of family and friends they have. Do they have a family doctor that they can talk to about these experiences? Are they connected with, if they're going through a high conflict divorce, there's a lot of meetup groups or a lot of, faith communities have groups that people can join. And those can be incredibly helpful because it's a very lonely experience, and we want to make sure people are properly connected and have a place where they belong and can open up. Um, yeah, and then I guess the last question we always want to ask them is around like what they feel like they need, right? Not imposing our wishes for them, but really taking the lead from them around how they want to move forward with their lives. Next slide, please. So the common types of services that we see being asked for by our clients are, well, there's a variety of them, but some of the top ones are in things like how to navigate the court system. That is a really big one for people that are in the process of separating or divorcing. Oftentimes, they're being cut off from their kids, they can't see their kids, and that can be incredibly devastating. And so, helping them connect with legal aid or a legal clinic of some sort, if they can't afford a private lawyer. Yeah, so just helping with that process. And then transitional housing that allows for children, that's another challenge. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources out there for that kind of support. We do have a few shelters here and there that will allow men to stay there, but it's not often very well advertised, and it's hard to know unless you're within the domestic violence sphere or the world, providing those kinds of services. Um, we get requests from men for financial support, whether that's retraining programs, um, or getting onto disability. So that's another common request. Then of course the mental health and peer support element, which is where we can really support as an agency, to provide help with if they are experiencing those symptoms around PTSD or depression or anxiety, to make sure that they have that addressed, and quickly as well, because it can be a long drawn out process as well. So we want to make sure that they are well supported. And then the last one on the slide there is substance abuse as well. Like I said, we don't offer that in-house, but we can connect them with appropriate resources. Next slide, please. So I thought I would just quickly talk about our group program because it is a program that's available province-wide in Alberta. And I think it's a very effective intervention. It is a space for men where they can gain a sense of community and a sense of belonging. Our program is actually facilitated by two therapists. We have typically a man and a woman facilitate the group. It's fairly structured. We have themes with every week that we cover with them. And there's that element of ongoing social connection, but also an element of skills development as well. Because a lot of these men, they go through this kind of experience and they wonder if I'm ever going to be able to have a healthy relationship. Am I ever going to know how to even do that or approach that? And so it's about rebuilding the self-esteem and shoring up that self-esteem with actual skills as well, relationship skills. Next slide, please. So for the group, we go through an assessment process with them. We do a safety risk assessment. We do need them to be at a certain level of functioning where they're able to actively participate, and also give other people space to participate and provide feedback. We used to offer this group in person, but right now we're only providing it virtually, which actually has opened up more possibilities for us to reach areas that are underserved in rural areas as well, since COVID-19. And yeah, so it's a 14-week group that meets on a weekly basis for 2 hours every week. I won't go through every week, but I want to just kind of highlight some of the themes that we cover. So this is the next slide. And yeah, so so some of the themes that we cover are around, defining abuse, like what is abuse? Often I think there's some confusion sometimes around what abuse actually is. And so it can be actually very helpful for individuals to kind of put language to it to really make it concrete and well understood. We also talk about resistance and how to respond to abuse. Um, and again, to address some of that shame, because a lot of men feel like, well, how did I let this happen? But then we can kind of highlight the ways that they did resist that abuse. It may not look like it from the outside, but there were good reasons for why they responded the way that they did. Next slide, please. We also talk about things like social influences, social stereotypes around gender and how that influences experiences of abuse. We talk about healthy relationships and also the different roles that we can take on in conflicting relationships. And then we also help them to kind of look at their own family of origin relationship patterns that often form a blueprint for how we approach our relationships moving forward. Next slide, please. And then also we kind of shift in the last 4 or 5 weeks to looking more forward to the future, and helping these men to think about where do they want to be, what are the next steps going to look like, and identifying also the progress that they've made over that 14-week period that the group runs, and it's often a pretty dramatic shift that we see. So I just wanted to provide that brief overview, and the feedback that we've gotten, that's the next slide, is really quite positive, right? So men have shared, and again, I won't read all of them, but they've shared that the online counseling experience was professional, it was flexible, it turned my life around, helped me to find the strength I needed to make the decisions that I needed to make to improve my life. It really provides them with a sense of community that many of these men lack. Next slide, please. In terms of results, so again, like all our programs, we do pre-measures and post-measures to make sure that we are providing a good quality service. And we see that 60% of the clients are either improved or recovered at the end of going through either individual counseling or group counseling with our programs. So yes, we do see quite significant shifts in terms of their functioning. And then the final slide is basically just some information on how to contact us. So we have the Calgary Counseling website where individuals can do an online intake. And then also in the gray box, there's my direct line and the men's outreach email address. If people want to reach out and find out more information, I encourage you to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It's really wonderful to hear that there is a service for men. I think there's been such a dearth of resources for men to go to when they experience violence. So it's really wonderful to hear about your program. I'm going to jump right in to the question and answer if you're ready. Yep.
Yeah, that's great.
Mark Goodall. Much abuse is through financial control. In recent years, women have increasingly become the primary breadwinners. Are there stats that indicate this is resulting in increasing financial control abuse of men?
Yeah, I mean, we do. I mean, I can't give you the exact stats on that, but I mean, I can speak from my clinical experience, just from what men have shared with me in sessions that, yes, there is a lot of financial control happening. And it can be quite varied, right? Like, I mean, we see clients who are perhaps new to the country, and they don't necessarily even know the systems in Canada, and they are reliant on their partner, and then that makes them quite dependent. So whenever there's a dependency, there's a vulnerability to that being abused. I would suspect that as more women have taken on more employment and opportunities, that with that, unfortunately, there does come that risk that men who are partnered with an abuser will get more abused. I mean, unfortunately, I can't give you an exact stat on that, but it is certainly something that we see in the work that we do.
Leona Jacobs, what have been the consequences of the pandemic on the incidences of domestic violence of men, specifically related to the news that there has been an overall increase in domestic abuse?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting couple of years for our program. I'll say that. We basically were running everything in person until March 16th. And then, of course, everything shut down, and we really had to scramble and figure out, okay, how are we going to continue to provide a service that obviously is needed? And it was interesting because at the start of the pandemic, there was almost a lull where people weren't reaching out, and it was kind of deathly silent for not for a long period, but for a couple of weeks. And I was curious about that, and then it started to pick up again, and it really ramped up. And I think it was just because as we all probably were for a time there, a little disoriented, right? And people were just kind of hunkering down and staying put and staying in the status quo. And so it certainly impacted in that way. In terms of the experiences of abuse, I think the pandemic has made it, more dangerous in some ways because of all the we're all staying at home, or many of us are staying at home more than before. That those kinds of coercive behaviors that involve things like stalking or things like monitoring other people's movements, things like monitoring who they're talking to. There's not as much privacy now because everybody's sort of limited in where you can go. That certainly has had, I think, a negative impact on men's experiences of intimate partner abuse in any case. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you brought that up, and I was going to ask you about that. What about all the sort of software that is out there in terms of a control over your children, but that's actually being used in abusive situations to control or to spy on partners. So how does your organization
Yeah.
deal with that? How?
I mean, it's a difficult challenge, right? Like, especially, when you know, mm, there's a fear that if you leave the home that you might never get back into the home. And so that you're staying there, but then you're being monitored all the time. So I can't tell you, like, I think it's very, it's very client specific in terms of how we respond to that. But it's a scary place to be when you don't have that ability to move freely. um, so yeah, I mean, I think in general, my advice would be to report it, right, to the authorities. But even then, there's concerns around, well, if I report it, will the police believe me? Will they pick my side, right? Like, there's a lot of fear around reaching out to authorities when these types of things happen. Typically we tell our clients, document as much as you can, make sure you have a paper trail of evidence, as much as you can. Um, and that there are no easy solutions. It's really about doing the best that we can, and making sure that it's not happening in secrecy, because secrecy is really what keeps that abuse going, right? And if you can kind of break that down, and have more people be aware of what's going on, even just that is a very powerful intervention.
Our next question comes from Laurie Schultz. Are you aware if university social work degree programs are including men's experiencing domestic abuse information in their curriculum?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I went through the University of Calgary social work program, and I mean, we didn't really have a lot of courses on domestic abuse, period. Um, Although there were some elected courses that we could take. But I mean, I didn't really learn about men's experiences of domestic abuse until I'd finished my degree, and got into the work that I was doing. Like, I just happened to work at an agency that had a program, and so I started to talk to the individual that was running the program prior to myself, and that was really where my eyes were opened. And I think there's still a lot of stigma around men's experiences of domestic abuse, and in some ways it makes sense, right? I mean, a lot of the services, the infrastructure around domestic violence, those things were built by women who were responding to women's experiences of domestic violence. And that's still that's still something that is very much happening and needs to be addressed. But I think we do need a larger lens that takes into account that domestic abuse happens to everyone, regardless of gender, regardless of background, or class. It really impacts everyone, and we can't let our biases prevent us from providing services to people, just based on their gender. And unfortunately, it still is a challenge for men. I mean, I've had clients call services that are domestic violence services, and they were clearly a victim, and they were referred to programs for men who use violence, right? And so that's still happening. I think it is shifting slowly. I think there is an awareness that this is an issue that is is happening, and that needs more attention, but it's not happening probably as fast as most of us would hope.
Can I just pick up on the gender binary? So if a gender non-binary person experiences domestic abuse, would they be referred somewhere? Would they even be able to attend any of the programs?
Yeah, I mean, That's a really good question. I mean, there's not a lot of programs, and that's something that I'm fairly passionate about myself, but there aren't a lot of programs that are targeted towards people that are non-binary or even in same-sex relationships. You know, and so often they're kind of, you know, they're serviced by the general services, but there isn't not necessarily there's not necessarily a good understanding of the dynamics that are slightly different, right, in those circumstances. In terms of our own program, I can speak to that. You know, we service anyone who is, you know, accessing our program. So if you're identifying as male, you know, my program will work with you. If you identify any other way, you can access our other family violence prevention programs at the agency. With the caveat that, you know, our groups that we offer are, you know, typically attended by the gender binary, you know, and so it's not that they're not permitted to attend those groups. It's just that it might not be particularly comfortable to do so. So typically in those cases, we work more individually with those clients.
Our next question comes from Leona Jacobs. You used the word recovered when talking about the post-counseling assessment. What does recovered look like?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So we use a questionnaire that is validated and widely used across the globe called the outcome questionnaire measure, OQ measure, and it basically divides people's functioning in different levels. So when we're saying recovered, what we mean is that those individuals have seen a drop in distress that now puts them in a zone where they're functioning at what's considered an average or normal level of functioning. And so it's not that they don't still have challenges in their lives, but that they now have what's considered the skills and the level, the supports that they need to be able to manage whatever is going on in their lives.
Our next question comes from Lori Schultz. Does your program collaborate with similar programs across the country and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, we're always open to collaborating, and you know, I sit on a number of boards, and part of that is also to build that sense of collaboration with other agencies. I mean, this isn't an issue that can be solved by one agency or by one person. We need to work together. So you know, we connect. You know, with some agencies in BC. I've connected with agencies across Alberta, and in Ontario as well. So yeah, we are always looking for opportunities to build those bridges.
Violet McMahon, do you take men in the program who are currently facing domestic assault charges themselves?
Yeah, so we do actually, you know, our agency does work with clients that are mandated as well. So clients that are referred through the court system or clients that are referred through the child services system as well. And they can certainly access the outreach program. There's no limitation on that. When it comes to the counseling or the group programs, typically what we recommend is that they go through our other services that are looking initially at their own behaviors, so where they've used violence and abuse, to address that. And once that has been addressed, then they can access the program, my program, for support on their experiences. Because we know that abuse it's not a thing where, I mean, you can be abusive and also be a victim of abuse, right? I think that binary, if we want to talk about binaries, that's not a particularly helpful binary sometimes for understanding domestic abuse, because it is, you know, in one relationship you can be abusive, and in another relationship you can be the victim of abuse, right? So really understanding abuse not as an identity, but more as a behavior or an event. Yeah.
How does the stereotypes of masculinity feed into this? I know you touched based a little bit on that in your presentation, but do you actually help men in terms of addressing some of the masculinity stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean, a lot. We have a whole week in the group program, but also in the individual work that we do, where we really look at, like, analyze the man box, and sort of like the expectations of what it means to be a man in today's world. There's a lot of contradictory messages that are being thrown around, and often I think men are feeling sort of lost in being allowed to feel good about being masculine, right? So there's a lot of pressure, I think, that men are feeling right now. So we spend quite a bit of time about looking at, what does healthy masculinity mean to you? Like, what does a good father mean to you, right? If we're talking about a father, who were your role models growing up? Who were the people that you looked up to? Both in the sort of in the public sphere, in the media and the movies, but also in your family, like in your family of origin. Who were the men that you looked up to as people that you wanted to emulate? Where did you learn? The ways that you respond to other people, our interpersonal relationships. We all tend to have certain stances that we take, and certain ways that we relate to other people, that they come from somewhere. They come from our earlier experiences, and so helping men to understand their own journey, their own story of who they are and how they got to be that person, can be really, I think, empowering, because then they can take that narrative back, and not be defined by their experience of abuse, but really write a new narrative for themselves moving forward.
Our next question comes from Laurie Schultz. Are your clients primarily self referrals? Do they receive referrals from police or other agencies?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say primarily yes, they are self referrals. There are people, but I mean, self referrals. They're referrals that have been recommended by other people. So because I mean, my program, it while we try to get the word out, it's not that well known. So often it's other agencies that are telling people about the program, and then they're accessing it that way. So we get referrals. Self referrals, but we also get referrals from other agencies. Child services refers to us. Sometimes we get referrals from, sometimes police will if they go to a situation where they suspect that the male's being abused, they might recommend that they come talk to us. Victim services, so we have a good mix, I think, of people that are providing us
I'm
referrals.
just going to skip the queue because Laurie has a follow up question that I think relates to this. So bear with me, folks, in the
Okay.
queue. I'll come back to you. Do you assist men to obtain peace bonds or a restraining order?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I basically provide them the information on how to go about doing it. I'm not a system navigator, in the sense that I'm not doing case management with each male that accesses us. I'm more someone that provides them information on how you would go about doing things, and then hopefully giving them some support. But yeah, unfortunately, the program is fairly small, so we do also have limited resources. But yes, we explain, like, the different types of restraining orders that are out there, what makes most sense. Do you need a restraining order? When do you need it? And what the steps are. So we provide some basic, I guess, information around what that process looks like.
Okay, our next question comes from Mark Goodall. Certain ethnic, cultural, or even religious norms do not see abuse as we see it in our culture. How often do you see this or deal with it?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, and I think it's not, most of the clients that we work with are Caucasian, Western, but we do have a small minority, and that's part of why I sit on the ethnocultural board with the CDVC. We do have a small minority of clients that do come from other ethnic backgrounds. In those cases, we tend to work with other agencies that are already active in those communities, to provide that cultural lens. But yeah, it can be an interesting challenge. For example, we'll have newcomers coming into the country, and there might be a lot of support and services for the female in that relationship, and she may gain a lot of more power in some ways than she did in the culture that she came from, but there aren't the same kinds of supports for the male, and often they really struggle to acclimatize or find work at the same level that they had before, and that can really disrupt the family dynamic. And that's not always a case of abuse, but it is a case of like the relationship is no longer healthy because those dynamics have been disrupted.
Our next question comes from Leona Jacobs. Do victims of domestic violence of men tend to return to the family unit once they are recovered?
I would say no. I would say the majority of the men that I see, they're kind of on the way out of that relationship. It's gotten so bad, and again, by the time that they reach out to professional supports, things have gotten pretty severe. So yeah, so typically they're at the place where they're now entering, divorce proceedings, trying to figure out custody and access and those kinds of things, and they're going their separate ways.
Mary Shillington, do you have any programs addressing the children in such abusive relationships?
Yeah, another really great question. So yeah, like I mentioned, kids are very much impacted by being exposed to this, and we know that from the research. So our agency does have a program that's actually geared for kids and the parents, where the kids meet once a week, to kind of do some fun activities together to learn some basic emotional regulation skills. And then the parents meet on a separate day, to learn ways that they can support their kids. So we have two groups in particular that are relevant here. So we have a group for children of divorce. Um, and then we also have a group that's called Responsible Choices for Children. That's a group that is for kids that maybe are learning to act out in ways that are disruptive or not healthy, and need some support in terms of that. So yes, we do provide that kind of
Okay,
support.
thank you very much. Leona says that I've missed one of her questions, but I'm looking back through the feed and I have asked all the questions that you've provided, Leona. So maybe just give us a little bit more information there. But that really was the last of our questions for today. Unless you have some more information to share with us, Stefan, I would like to put up your PowerPoint on how to contact. And while people are looking up your contact details, I know that SACPA mostly does southern Alberta. So what about rural folks and folks who are living in Lethbridge? Are they welcome in your program?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, in some ways, that's the silver lining of all of this COVID situation that we're all navigating, is that it's really opened us up to not be as geographically limited as we've been in the past. I mean, I don't think that the virtual service delivery is going to go away at any point. We may go back to in-person services, in addition, but I think the virtual services that we've been providing, we're seeing great results, from our outcome data. So that I think will continue, and it does open up the world for rural people to be able to participate in whether it's one-on-one counseling or group counseling, but to actually be able to benefit from some of the resources that we have.
We just got one more question coming in from Laurie Schultz. Does your program work with domestic abuse family court? Are judges educated on these issues? Rather?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't particularly work with the judges, but I do know that people higher up than me in the agency do that kind of collaboration with the legal system. There are more education opportunities, for lawyers and for judges that are being, offered. Um, so I think, like I said, I think it is slowly shifting. It is slowly changing. It is getting on people's radar. It's just it's moving slow, and it's inconsistent. I think, for example, I hear from clients in Calgary where they have positive experiences, but then, when you're talking to individuals that are perhaps outside of the city, in rural areas, they have more negative experiences. So I think it's just inconsistent right now where the level of knowledge is around this issue, but it is slowly changing.
And then, Laura Schultz, thank you, Stefan, for your informative presentation on the important issue. You may have touched on this, but are there residential programs for men if they need to leave?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there aren't a lot. I think I briefly mentioned that, yeah, shelters overall, they're mostly for women, but there are some programs. So there's the Wheatland Crisis Shelter, which, it's Strathmore, so a bit far away from Lethbridge. But, I would still, if someone that's going through an experience like this, I would still suggest reaching out to like domestic violence shelters, because some of them don't advertise that they provide this type of support, but they do, and they will on a case by case basis. So there are resources out there. Not a lot of them are publicly advertising it. There's really just that one shelter that I'm aware of in Calgary that does it. But hopefully that also is something that will change as we move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Excuse me. Before we wrap up this session, do you have a take-home message for our viewers?
Yeah, I kind of want to just leave with a quote that one of our clients actually shared with us when he went through our program, and I thought it really captured kind of the spirit of today's presentation. And he said, "I don't want abused women to be hurt or continue to be abused. That's not the point. The point is everybody who is abused has got to be treated properly, because it really not only hurts that person, but it screws up society, the children, the community, you name it. And the stereotypes have got to end." And I think that really captures, what I'm hoping to do is to maybe just challenge some of the stereotypes that exist around, domestic violence.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And for our viewers, please join us next week on the topic of the climate emergency and the future of fossil fuels. And we have Sephora Berman, the International Program Director at Stand.Earth. So I hope you'll join us for that. And we'll end the stream. Thank you.